Hello everyone, welcome back to Intro to Mind and Will. This week we're going to be finishing up our unit on dualism. Specifically, we're going to start looking at some criticisms of dualism. Right? Last time we saw why you might be a dualist from Descartes. This time we're going to hear from Princess Elizabeth and Gilbert Ryle as to why dualism maybe doesn't work. Right? Okay, first a recap. So remember, dualism, specifically substance dualism, that's what we're talking about here, right? Is this idea that there's two distinct substances. There's the mental and then there's the physical, right? So there's two distinct modes of being. These two substances possess different kinds of qualities, right? The physical is extended in space and time, right? It has mass, it has form, it has shape, it can be cut up, it can be divided. These things aren't true of the mental, so the dualist says, right? You cannot carve up a feeling or a thought. You can't do that, right? It's not tangible. It's not in space, right? So these two things must be different, so the dualist says. This allows us to accommodate some of the insights we got from Nagel, for instance. Nagel, who suggests that no matter how much you know about the physical nature of the world, you are never going to encounter the taste of chocolate, right? So even if you're the best neuroscientist you could possibly be, and were granted access to someone's brain while they were tasting chocolate, you're never going to see the taste of chocolate there, right? Because it's not the same kind of thing. So dualism can accommodate that kind of insight pretty easily. You would not expect to be able to find the chocolate in the body, the taste of chocolate in the body, right? Because they're two different things. The mind and the body are separate. Okay, so there are some reasons why you might be a dualist. Okay, but it has some nuance as well. And this nuance is ultimately going to be the downfall of the view, right? So it seems to be the case, the dualist holds, that our bodies sometimes affect our minds and vice versa. So for example, when you stub your toe, that's an instance of your body, right? Something happening in your body that then affects your mind. You feel pain, right? You get the experience of pain. It seems like your body is constantly informing your mind of its own condition, what it sees in the world, what it smells. It's informing your mind about its internal state and external state, right? Similarly, your mind seems to be able to affect your body, right? You can have an idea, oh, I'm going to get up right now, right? That inspires physical action. So the intangible mind seems to be able to have some effect on the tangible body. Okay, well, when you put it that way, it doesn't seem that controversial. But here's the problem. If these two things really are distinct substances, how are they capable of interacting with one another? Well, that's Princess Elizabeth's question, right? That's her objection to substance dualism, Descartes' dualism specifically. So this is Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. We are reading her through McWeeny, who is a contemporary philosopher. McWeeny just gives a really good presentation of Princess Elizabeth's concerns. Otherwise, you'd have to read these like letters between her and Descartes, which takes quite some time and are somewhat dry, right? But some, like McWeeny, credit Princess Elizabeth not just for this objection, which is the greatest objection that dualists have to deal with, I'd say, but also with the origin of the mind-body problem altogether. Right? So you can't really understate the influence of Princess Elizabeth on the philosophy of mind. Her objection is relatively simple. If the mind and the body are two different kinds of things, such that one of them is extended in space, right? It has form and has mass, and the other does not, then it should not be possible for them to interact, right? If one of them is a tangible thing and the other is an intangible thing, they should not be able to interact. Why? Well, because we know about things that are tangible, right? We can study them. We have seen that the only way in which there are causes that render effects in them, it has to do with contact or physical form, right? But if the mind has no ability to physically contact this way, and it has no physical form, by what means could it possibly interact with the physical, right? If the mind is entirely a different substance, it doesn't have a form, it's completely immaterial, in what way does it impinge? In what way does it make contact with the physical body? In the same, the other direction. The body, which is entirely physical, it has no immaterial parts, right? It can't, because they're supposed to be separate substances. How could it possibly affect something non-physical? There's nothing for it to bump into, right? There's nothing for it to bump into. So how can it possibly affect the immaterial? Well, this is a very deep problem, and Descartes certainly takes it seriously. In fact, our second reading from last week, we read some excerpts of Passions of the Soul, was written because of this exchange he had with Princess Elizabeth, right? After this exchange, he went and wrote this and dedicated the piece to her. Now, his response in the Passions of the Soul is not good enough, right, to put it lightly. In the Passions of the Soul, remember, Descartes' solution, which we got before the presentation of the problem, was to argue that, well, hey, there is this part in the body that has special properties such that it can make contact between the two, right? The pineal gland, to be specific, because it's centrally located in the brain, must be capable of interacting with both, right? Well, okay, that doesn't really answer the problem, because the pineal gland is a physical thing, right? It's part of the body. You're just going to have the same problem again. How does the pineal gland, which is an extended thing, a physical thing, a material thing, have any means of connecting with the immaterial, which has no parts? It doesn't seem like he's really solved the problem. He's just sort of pushed it back a little bit, right? He offers two other solutions elsewhere in his works that most people also take to be unsatisfying. The first is that maybe the question, how do these two things interact, is poorly framed, right? Maybe it's not a real problem to solve. Maybe it's a linguistic problem, right? So maybe the way in which we're speaking about causation when we ask the question is mistaken, and therefore the question cannot reasonably be answered. Well, this doesn't really work because Descartes has a lot to say about causation in his own work, and he talks about mechanics in exactly the same way Princess Elizabeth does. In fact, Descartes was Princess Elizabeth's teacher, right? So she is getting all of this understanding of mechanics from Descartes, right? He is the one suggesting that physical things do operate mechanically in this way, right? And so you would expect, if a thing is going to be able to interact with those mechanics, for it to be physical as well. So it doesn't really work. Second, a little more interesting, but still not great, is this notion that maybe it's just impossible for us to understand, right? Maybe it's beyond human understanding how the mind can interact with the body despite the mind having no physical parts with which to do so, right? So let's talk about this idea of defending a notion through ignorance really quickly. This final move ought to raise suspicion in us. Why? Because if you allow this move here, you're going to have to allow this move everywhere, right? If you allow the move that, well, we simply aren't capable of understanding something without reason for thinking that that's the case, and use that to justify believing in something, you're going to be able to justify believing in just about everything, right? So we can make any number of claims that don't have obvious support, or maybe even claims that we have reason for rejecting right now, and then attempt to support them in exactly the same way. Oh, well, this seems strange, I agree, but it's just beyond human understanding. Right? Okay, well, anything goes, right? So say I believe that the Earth is flat despite having seen for myself that the horizon has a certain curvature. Well, it could just be that my mind is incapable of squaring these two truths, right? That the Earth is flat and we see curvature when we look at the horizon. So it's okay for me to conclude the Earth is flat anyway. Right? No, we don't want to say that, right? So the key mistake here is that you might think you're still entitled to your conclusion after you use this move, right? The move being an appeal to ignorance, right? or an appeal to ignorance in principle, right? Because our human understanding is limited, we just won't know the truth of the matter. Okay, well, if that's the case, if you want to make that claim, we can never know, right? We can never know. We'll never understand the truth. You're not still then entitled to your conclusion, right? You don't still get to assert your conclusion. You now are claiming ignorance. You should remain ignorant, right? In the same way that when Descartes says, well, look, we'll just never understand how the mind and the body interact. It's beyond human understanding. That does not mean he then gets to keep saying, but they really do, right? They do in fact interact. He should now accept that he's ignorant, if that's the case. Maybe they don't. Maybe they do. I don't know. We can't understand it, right? Okay. So what becomes a dualism then? Well, this problem is a serious one. The problem of interaction. Very serious. In fact, many philosophers today don't think dualists have a good way of dealing with it, even still, right? If you don't have a way of accounting for this interaction, how it could even in principle be possible, then it seems like you no longer get to say that the mind and the body interact, right? But it seems pretty clear that they do. You're left with these two choices, right? You either have to adopt a different kind of dualism. I think we briefly spoke about parallelism, remember, which is the view that the mind and the body are two distinct things that never interact. They're just going along a similar track, right? Like God has put them on a similar track such that everything kind of works out, but they don't actually interact. When you stub your toe, your body does not communicate to your mind, I'm in pain. You just happen to be in pain at the same time your body stubs its toe. There's no real connection there, right? No one wants to be a parallelist, right? So you either have to resort to a view like that, where interaction is no longer a problem because you invited a bunch of other problems, or you have to abandon the idea. You have to abandon the idea that the mind and the body are distinct substances, okay? And then this problem of interaction goes away. If everything is the same kind of thing, you no longer have the question, well, how are they interacting with one another, right? But this isn't the only problem facing the dualist. The interaction problem is not the only thing they have going on. Next up, we're going to look at Gilbert Ryle, right? Ryle also attacks dualism, but along different grounds. This is a portrait of Ryle. This comes from a book that he wrote in 1949 that's just about attacking dualism. It's called The Concept of the Mind. We're just reading the first chapter of the book. It's called Descartes' Myth. That's the chapter we're reading. Okay. He wants to argue that not only is dualism wrong, not only is dualism false, but it's false in principle. Okay? Now, there's a distinction between just being false and being false in principle. A thing can just be false because, well, the facts of the matter happen to be that way, right? If something is false in principle, that means it could never be true. It could never be true. That's much more serious. We'll see why he thinks that's true of dualism. Okay. Specifically, he thinks that the dualist is making a mistake of language, right? They're making a mistake in their use of language. He thinks they're committing what he calls a category mistake. Okay, this is where this term is born. We use it a lot in philosophy now, but Ryle is the originator of this term, category mistake. So what is a category mistake? Well, a category mistake is when someone tries to apply a category, a way of describing or thinking about a thing, to something that does not fit that category, right? So it's like a conceptual error or an error in language in which someone doesn't really understand the categories that they're trying to use, okay? He gives some pretty helpful illustrations. The most famous one is the first one that we get out of his writing. It has to do with a university, like someone walking around a university. Here's the quote. A foreigner visiting Oxford or Cambridge for the first time is shown a number of colleges, libraries, playing fields, museums, scientific departments, and administrative offices. He then asks, but where is the university? I've seen where the members of the colleges live, where the registrar works, where the scientists experiment, and the rest, but I have not yet seen the university in which reside and work the members of your university. Right? Can you see the mistake? they're expecting the university to be something like a building, like all of these colleges are, and the library and the museums, right? They're expecting it to be a similar thing. But that is not the kind of thing that a university is. So they're committing a category error, a category mistake. They're placing university in a category that it does not belong to. And in doing so, they're failing to see it for what it is. Okay. They've already seen the university, right? There's another example that he gives that you can translate to make it a little bit easier, right? So, for example, you might be at a parade and see a marching band go by, right? And someone could say to you, well, hey, I've seen the flutes, I've seen the trumpets, I've seen the trombones and the drums, but where's the marching band? I haven't seen the marching band go by yet, right? Clearly, they've made a mistake, right? Clearly, they've made a mistake. That is the marching band. In thinking that the marching band is some individual unit of instruments like trumpets, trombones, etc., they have made a category mistake, right? They think the marching band concept applies to a category that it does not. Okay. Because of this, every time someone makes a category mistake like this, they're going to end up thinking that the phenomena they're looking for is something of a ghost, right? Why? Because they haven't seen it. You've shown everything to me, and I still haven't seen it. You showed me all the buildings, but I still haven't seen the university. You showed me all of those people going by with instruments, but you still haven't shown me the marching band. Where is the marching band, right? So Ryle argues it becomes something like a ghost. When you make a category mistake, the thing that you're miscategorizing becomes something like a ghost. You know it's there somewhere, but you can't find it. You can't spot it, right? He thinks the dualist does the same thing. He calls this ghost in the machine, right? You've probably heard that expression before. It comes out of Ryle. It comes out of this piece. Okay, so Ryle thinks dualists are having exactly the same, they're committing exactly the same kind of mistake. So in this case, I observe all of my physiology, right? I see all of my body. I observe all of my behavior, all of the neural activity that's supposedly associated with my thinking, my feeling, my tasting of chocolate, right? But I still can't say that I've seen my thought or my feeling or my taste of chocolate. So what's the solution? Well, it's not here, right? It's a ghost, right? In the same way that the marching band is. I've looked at all that there is to see. I've seen the body, I've seen the brain, I've seen everything. But where's the mind, right? I don't see it. In some way, it then must be detached from all these other things, right? Can you see the move, right? In the same way that the marching band is supposed to be detached from all these groups of instruments, so too is the mind thought to be detached from the mind, from the body, all these things that make up the body, right? So ultimately, Ryle is arguing that the dualists are just defining the mental incorrectly, right? They're defining the mental as something independent of the body when they have no reason to do so. Further, he thinks that this becomes clear when you look at how they define the mental afterwards, right? He's more or less poking directly at Descartes here, right? When saying that the mental are not in space, they are not motions, they are not modifications of matter, they are not accessible to public observation. Further, they're not divisible, right? We hear a lot about what the mind is not, but we don't hear a lot about what the mind is, right? Ryle thinks the fact that they're defining what the mind is by using opposition, right? By negating things that are physical, right? They're just showing you that, well, I don't know what this is, but when I look around, I'm still not seeing it, right? Well, then you don't know what you're looking for, right? Maybe you're just misapplying the category. Okay, to wrap up then, we'll look at just like one more, I think, critique from Ryle and new directions. Okay, so he further develops this point against the ghost in the machine, right? He thinks dualists are committed to this idea of there being a ghost in the machine by pointing out some other unfortunate consequences that come about if you accept dualism. The first is that you have agreed that the mind is not accessible, right? The mind is accessible to us, okay? Like I seem to know what my own thoughts are. I know what my own feelings are. I know what my own taste of chocolate is like. But I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't know what your taste of chocolate is like. These things evade me, right? In fact, they seem to be, in principle, never graspable by me. There's nothing I can do to get at them. Okay, well, if the mind is the same thing as the body, they form a complex system, whatever, I can still get to your mind by looking at your physicality, right? Like the physicalist, for example, who thinks that the mind just is the brain. Okay, well, I can look at your brain, and in seeing that you have a brain, I know you have a mind. But if I think these two things are completely separate, as the dualist thinks, well, now I have no reason for thinking that you do have a mind. In making it inaccessible to anyone else, the dualist has made it such that we lose all reason to think that anyone but us has a mind. I have no direct evidence of it, right? You might say, well, we can observe other people's behavior and it could seem reasonable or not reasonable. Well, that's all physical stuff. That's all physical. And as we know, as the dualist tells us, the mind is not physical. And therefore, these things are not evidence, right? So it seems like an unfortunate consequence of dualism is that you no longer have the grounds from which you can say other people have minds, right? Ryle says, very quickly, only our bodies can meet, right? So the only parts of us that can ever contact, the only parts of us that we can ever have evidence for are just our bodies, right? Our bodies, our behaviors, etc. The physical things, not mental things. Okay, that's a rather unfortunate consequence, right? So Ryle thinks we have plenty of good reason to reject dualism as nonsensible, right? First, we have plenty good reason to reject it as nonsensible, but even worse, he wants to say it's not only nonsensible, it's just a mistake. The dualist has just made it a category mistake. It's a mistake of language. And once you clear away this mistake of language, you'll see that actually mind is just another way of talking. It's just another way of talking. In the same way that saying, I'll give you a list, trombones, flutes, drums, etc. That's just another way of talking about band or marching band. They're not different. They're one and the same thing, but I'm talking about them in two different ways, right? That's the solution. So what should take dualism's place if it doesn't work? Well, a number of philosophers, and psychologists especially, started to share Ryle's view, right? That the mental and the physical are just these two different ways of talking about the same thing. And some of these thinkers adopted a view that we call behaviorism. Very loosely put, behaviorism is just the idea that we should only identify the mind with that which we can observe, which is your behavior, right? So what is a thought? What is a feeling? There's certain observed behaviors. Okay, so we're going to hear from the behaviorist next time. Of course, there's going to be plenty of room to push back, but we'll see when we get there. All right, until then, stay healthy, stay safe.